Clara Brooks never imagined her first kiss would come from a stranger, let alone be tangled in a deal she didn't understand until it was too late to back out. She was the kind of girl most people looked past, not because she lacked beauty, but because she didn't know how to weaponize it. Her hair was always pulled back, her clothes practical, her eyes careful. She had never been drunk, never been kissed, never even been truly chosen. At 24, Clara had grown used to the safety of invisibility, until the day Elias Monroe walked into her life with a proposal that would unravel everything she thought she knew about control, about pretending, about feeling. It began with spilled coffee and a stranger's scowl. Clara had just bombed another job interview, the kind where they smile politely and call her sweet, but then say they're looking for someone more dynamic. She had heard every version of rejection possible. That day, walking out into the gray sprawl of Manhattan, she carried her worn leather portfolio close to her chest like armor. She didn't see the man stepping out of the sleek black town car until it was too late. Their collision was small, but sharp enough to knock the coffee out of her hand and right across the front of his crisp white shirt. "Oh my God," she gasped, scrambling for napkins, her face flushing deep red. "I'm so sorry, I didn't see." He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse. He just looked at her. The kind of look that stripped noise from the street, that made her feel seen and then judged in the same breath. His face was angular, expensive-looking, as if someone had sculpted him out of indifference and wealth. She stammered another apology, trying to wipe the mess from his shirt, until he gently caught her wrist and said, "Don't, it's just a shirt." That should have been the end of it. But as he stepped away, he turned back and said something she would never forget. "You're exactly the kind of girl who wouldn't survive a weekend in my world." It wasn't cruel, not really. It was a challenge. And Clara, who had never taken risks, never accepted dares, found herself wondering what it would be like to enter a world that didn't belong to her. 3 days later, she got an email from a name she remembered only because of that moment: Elias Monroe. The message was short, clinical, and surreal. He needed someone to pose as his girlfriend for 5 days, starting immediately. There would be a contract, boundaries, generous compensation. It wasn't illegal, he assured her, just inconvenient. He needed a shield from the press, a distraction from questions, a delay in the family's push for a politically convenient engagement. Clara stared at the screen, her heart in her throat. She should have deleted it. She should have laughed. Instead, she reread it 4 times, then Googled him. Billionaire, CEO of a luxury conglomerate, famously cold, famously single, famously impossible. She thought of the way he'd looked at her, like he saw something she didn't even know was there, and for reasons she didn't understand, she typed back 2 words. "I'm interested." What she didn't type was the truth, that she had never done anything reckless before, that she had never kissed anyone, that sometimes, late at night, she wondered what it would feel like to be touched and not flinch. She hit send, and in that instant, she stepped off the edge of the life she'd known, and into the arms of a man who didn't believe in softness. Not yet. Clara Brooks had always kept her life small, not because she lacked ambition, but because she understood early on how little room the world made for girls like her, girls who were quiet, unpolished, and unremarkably ordinary. She didn't come from money, influence, or charm. She came from resilience. Raised by her aunt in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Queens, Clara knew how to stretch a dollar, how to go unnoticed, how to disappear in a crowd. She worked evenings at a bookstore cafe, pored over design textbooks in between customers, and took community college courses in fashion on weekends, not because she believed she'd ever debut at Fashion Week, but because sewing made her feel like she was building something permanent in a world that changed too fast. At 24, Clara had never been kissed, not because she was waiting for something sacred or romantic, though she sometimes dreamed of that too, but because no one had ever really seen her. Boys in school flirted with louder girls. College was a blur of survival, bills, schedules, exhaustion. The few who had shown interest always stopped short of choosing her, and maybe that was the wound she carried most quietly, never being anyone's first choice. The night she agreed to Elias Monroe's offer, she wasn't trying to change her life. She was just tired of saying no to every strange door that opened. This time, she stepped through. Elias Monroe was everything Clara wasn't. The first time she entered his penthouse suite to discuss the arrangement, she felt like she'd wandered onto a movie set. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Everything was marble, glass, or leather. Cold, calculated, impossibly curated. And there he was, tall, crisp, dressed in a dark gray suit that probably cost more than her rent for a year. He didn't smile when she arrived. He offered her tea, but didn't sit beside her. He walked her through the details like it was a business pitch, which in truth, it was. He needed a girlfriend. Not a real one, not in the emotional sense. Just someone to appear beside him for a handful of events, a few carefully staged photo opportunities, enough time to silence the board, deflect the press, and stall his family's pressure to finalize an engagement with a woman Clara later learned came from a family old enough to own an entire block of Fifth Avenue. She wasn't a threat. That was the point. Clara was chosen because she had no connections, no scandals, no power, because she could be controlled. Clara listened, nodding in all the right places, her hands tucked into her lap. She should have felt insulted, but all she felt was curiosity. And when Elias asked if she had any questions, she surprised both of them by saying, "What do I need to pretend to be in love with you?" There was a flicker barely visible in his eyes. Then he answered, "Nothing. Just pretend I'm not a stranger." The rules were clear. She would be paid generously. There would be no physical contact unless required for appearances. She would be given a wardrobe, a driver, a publicist's talking points. In return, she'd keep her mouth shut, smile at the cameras, and vanish when it was over. 5 days. Nothing more. The next day, Clara was swept into a different life. A stylist met her at dawn. Designer gowns were draped over her body like armor. Her hair was blown out, her makeup done in soft, expensive shades. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize herself, but Elias did. When she arrived at the gala that evening, his first public appearance in months, he reached for her hand without hesitation. His fingers were cool, his grip steady. To anyone watching, they looked seamless, effortless, and Clara had never felt more seen. The first night blurred past in flashes of camera lights and murmured introductions. Elias barely spoke, but every time someone addressed her directly, he kept a hand on her back. Light, firm, grounding. When they returned to the car, she exhaled like she hadn't breathed in hours. "Did I do okay?" she asked. He didn't look at her, just answered, "No one asked who you were. That's a win." It wasn't a compliment, not really, but Clara tucked it away anyway, like a flower pressed in a book. Over the next few days, the charade deepened. They attended charity dinners, board meetings, a weekend brunch at his family's estate. Clara played her role perfectly. She laughed at the right times. She wore pearls. She learned how to glide through rooms filled with cold smiles and champagne. Elias remained composed, always one step ahead. But in the quiet spaces between the performances, something began to shift. He started asking questions. Nothing grand, just small things. Why fashion design? Do you drink coffee or tea? What's the last thing that made you cry? And Clara answered, not because she had to, but because no one had asked her those things in years. She told him about growing up on thrift store dresses, about how she loved watching people on the subway and sketching their coats in the margins of her journal, about how sometimes she felt like she was borrowing her own life, like it never fully belonged to her. And Elias listened, not politely, not distractedly, but like he was storing every word, every look, every pause. There were moments when his fingers would linger too long on hers, when his gaze would settle on her lips during a silence that felt too thick to ignore. But he never crossed the line. Not yet. Clara wasn't falling for him. She told herself that again and again. This was fake, temporary. She was still the same unkissed girl who walked into that coffee shop weeks ago. But every time Elias touched her hand for a photo, or brushed a strand of hair from her face as a photographer shouted instructions, something in her ached, not with desire, but with a kind of yearning she didn't have a name for yet. She didn't want his world. She just wanted to matter in it. By the fourth night, Clara had learned how to wear diamonds without flinching, how to answer invasive questions with deflective charm, and how to walk in 5-inch heels like she belonged in them. But what she hadn't learned, what she couldn't control, was the way Elias Monroe was beginning to look at her when no one else was watching. They were halfway through a benefit dinner at the rooftop ballroom of the Langham Hotel. Clara wore a silver satin gown that draped over her like water. Her hair was pinned into soft waves, her neckline bare except for a borrowed sapphire pendant that rested just above her collarbone. Elias had chosen the dress. She didn't know why. But when he saw her walk out of the dressing room, earlier that evening, he didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. His eyes had swept over her like a quiet storm, and then he said, "You'll need a coat for later, it gets cold up there." Nothing more. But his voice had sounded rougher than usual, as if words were suddenly too fragile to carry. That night, they sat closer than usual at the table, and when a woman from the press leaned across and asked, "So how did you two meet?" Elias didn't hesitate. "At a bookstore. She was reading a book I hated. I told her she was wasting her time." Clara blinked. It wasn't true, but she smiled anyway. "And I told him he should learn to read past the first chapter." The woman laughed, scribbling in her notepad. But Elias didn't laugh. He looked at Clara like she'd surprised him, like maybe he'd just learned something about her that wasn't written in the script. Later that evening, after the last toast had been made and the final photo taken, Elias didn't call for the car. Instead, he offered her his arm and led her to the private terrace. The city glittered below, quiet and endless. Clara leaned against the railing, her heels dangling from her fingers, her bare feet touching cool stone. Elias stood beside her, jacket draped over his shoulder, collar undone. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then he asked, "Why did you say yes?" She turned to him. "To your offer?" He nodded. "Because I wanted to know what it would feel like to be part of someone else's story, even for a little while." He studied her in silence. "You don't belong in the background, Clara." "That's not what people usually say." "Then they're not paying attention." There was something dangerous in the air between them, not lust, not quite. It was the danger of being seen, of being known too deeply. Elias reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered for a second too long. "You should go in," he said finally. "It's cold." But he didn't move, neither did she. The next morning something shifted. Elias was late to a press meeting. He forgot to confirm a partnership deal. His assistant, Blake, noticed. "You're distracted," he said bluntly as Elias scrolled through his phone for the third time in 10 minutes. "This about the girl?" Elias didn't answer, but Blake didn't need one. "Be careful," he warned. Feelings weren't part of the contract. Elias hated that word feelings. It made everything sound irrational, messy, unnecessary. But what he felt around Clara didn't feel chaotic. It felt inevitable. It wasn't about how she looked in the gowns or the way she smiled when people complimented her. It was about the way she listened when he spoke about things no one else asked about. The way she didn't flinch when he was quiet for too long. The way she sat beside him like her presence wasn't conditional. That night, Clara stayed at the penthouse for the first time, not because anything had happened, but because the fundraiser had run late and her driver had disappeared. Elias offered her the guest room without looking at her directly. She nodded, unsure of what to say. In the elevator, they didn't speak, but their silence had a pulse, a tension, something neither of them wanted to name. Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window in the oversized shirt the stylist had left in her wardrobe bag, one of Elias's, apparently. Crisp, clean, too big on her frame. She wrapped her arms around herself, watching the city breathe in the distance. When she heard the soft sound of footsteps, she didn't turn. "Can't sleep?" he asked from the doorway. She shook her head. He stepped closer. "It's strange, isn't it? Pretending to belong in a world that doesn't really fit." She looked at him. "Is that what you feel?" He paused. "Every day." She swallowed. "Then why keep pretending?" His answer came slowly. "Because sometimes the illusion is all you have left." She didn't respond. The distance between them felt like glass, breakable, reflective. When he finally stepped back, he said, "If I touch you now, Clara, it won't be pretend anymore." And with that, he left her standing in the soft spill of moonlight, her heart thudding like it had been given a new rhythm. The next day, everything spiraled. Elias's mother arrived from Europe unannounced, elegant, poised, and cold as glass. She eyed Clara with the precision of someone used to appraising value. Over dinner, she spoke only in questions disguised as observations. "She's sweet. Where did you find her? Does she know how temporary this is? You've always had a soft spot for wounded things." Clara smiled through it, but her hands shook under the table. Elias remained calm, but his jaw tensed every time his mother spoke. After she left, he apologized. "She doesn't like anyone." Clara looked at him. "She doesn't have to like me. I'm not really your girlfriend." Elias didn't answer, but his silence said more than words. That night, as Clara stood in the guest room doorway, she whispered, "Do you ever wish you were free from all of this?" Elias didn't turn. Every second. Then he looked at her, and something broke. "But freedom comes with a cost. One I've never been willing to pay." She nodded, understanding, and still she stepped closer. It was the first time they shared a bed, not in passion, but in stillness. He didn't touch her. She didn't reach for him. They simply lay side by side, breathing in the same air, listening to the city fall asleep outside the window. Clara closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm not afraid of you." Elias turned his head. "You should be." But she wasn't. Not then. What they didn't know was that the illusion was starting to crack, that the arrangement, meant to be clean and simple, had grown roots neither of them could cut. And in that quiet, tangled space between pretending and possibility, something unspoken had already begun to bloom. The next morning, Clara awoke to soft golden light streaming across the duvet, her body still tangled in warmth not her own. Elias hadn't left the bed. He lay still beside her, eyes closed, one hand resting loosely over the space between them. His breathing was deep even. For a moment, Clara didn't move. She studied the lines of his face, the tension that never fully left his brow, the faint shadow of a scar near his jaw, the way his mouth was slightly parted like he had finally surrendered to sleep. This wasn't the man the world saw. This wasn't the calculating CEO with a billion-dollar voice and an armor of indifference. This was Elias undone. And for reasons she didn't yet understand, it made her chest ache. She slipped out of bed quietly, wrapped herself in a soft blanket, and padded into the kitchen. The penthouse was silent, serene. It didn't feel sterile anymore. It felt lived in. A half-empty teacup sat near the sink, A linen napkin, folded neatly. Her sketchbook, he must have moved it from her bag, was sitting on the counter, opened to a half-finished drawing she didn't remember showing anyone. She blinked at it, then at the note scribbled beside it in Elias's handwriting. You see things others miss. Don't let this world make you stop. Later, over breakfast, they didn't talk about the night they spent in bed. Instead, Elias poured coffee and asked, "What's the first thing you ever made?" Clara hesitated. "A dress for my aunt's birthday. I didn't have money for a gift, so I used some old fabric and sewing scraps. It was too big, and the stitching was uneven, but she wore it anyway, told me I had magic in my hands." Elias looked at her, something soft flickering behind his eyes. "You do." The day passed quietly. The press was focused elsewhere. The upcoming gala, the launch of a new Monroe Global line, the whisperings about Elias's potential engagement to a European heiress, all things Clara had learned to ignore. What mattered now wasn't the noise. It was the space between them. And it was shrinking. That evening, Elias took her to his private home just outside the city, not the penthouse, not the corporate residence, but a quiet glass-walled estate tucked into a hillside overlooking the Hudson. "No staff," he said. "No press. Just us." Clara stood in the center of the minimalist living room, surrounded by soft light, the hum of nature, and silence that felt sacred. She turned slowly. "Why did you bring me here?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He walked to a cabinet, opened it, and pulled out a photo. A young boy, dark-haired, eyes too serious for his age. "This is me, age 10, the day after my father told me he'd lost everything. The day I realized being rich doesn't mean being safe." Clara stepped closer. "What happened?" Elias's voice was quiet. "A deal went wrong. A partner betrayed him. My mother left 6 months later. He drowned himself in lawsuits and pride. I drowned myself in control." He set the photo down, but his hand lingered. "I built Monroe Global because I had nothing else. No family, no forgiveness. I've lived my whole life proving I'm not weak, that I can't be hurt. And then you showed up, and I started to forget why I ever needed the armor." Clara's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to break anything." "You didn't break me," Elias said, stepping closer. "You reminded me that I'm still alive. That night, in that house that had never felt like home to him," Elias kissed her for the first time. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, reverent. He touched her face like it was something precious, not pretty. When their lips met, it wasn't about possession. It was about presence. Clara felt it deep in her bones, the way her heart shifted, how her breath caught, how her whole world narrowed to the space between them. When he pulled away, his forehead resting against hers, he whispered, "I've kissed women before. But this is the first time it meant something." They didn't make love that night. Elias didn't ask, and Clara didn't offer. They lay on the couch, wrapped in blankets, her head on his chest, his fingers gently tracing circles on her back. "I used to think love was something dramatic," Clara murmured, "loud, messy, fireworks and falling. And now?" Elias asked. "Now I think it's something else, a choice, a whisper that says, 'Stay.'" Elias nodded slowly. "Then stay." In the days that followed, the facade began to blur. Elias canceled a meeting to have breakfast with her. He asked her opinion on a new ad campaign. He showed her the sketchbook he kept hidden, filled not with contracts or graphs, but buildings he dreamed of designing when he was younger. Clara brought him a book of poetry she loved. He read it aloud one night, voice soft in the dark. They weren't pretending anymore, not in the moments that mattered, but outside, pressure mounted. Elias's board was restless. The Monroe family specifically, his grandfather, The company's founding patriarch had scheduled a formal dinner, a final attempt to push Elias toward an engagement with someone more appropriate. Someone of our world, the old man had said. Elias didn't tell Clara immediately. He didn't want her to feel the weight of what was coming, but she sensed it anyway. One evening, she found him staring at the skyline from his office, fists clenched. "What is it?" she asked gently. "They want me to marry someone I don't love," he said flatly, "because it'll save a merger, because it'll stabilize the brand, because it'll prove I'm still in control." Clara stepped forward. "And what do you want?" He looked at her like it was the first time someone had ever asked. "I want a life that feels real. I want you." She touched his hand. "Then fight for it." They knew the fallout was coming. Elias had spent years building walls no one could breach, and now he was about to tear them down for a girl who had no legacy, no wealth, no power, just honesty, just love. When the formal dinner came, Elias brought Clara with him, not as a girlfriend, not as an assistant, but as his partner. He held her hand the entire time. He introduced her with pride. And when his grandfather asked, "Are you really willing to throw away everything for her?" Elias answered simply, "I'd rather build everything from scratch again with her than keep this empire and lose myself." Clara didn't speak. She didn't have to. In that moment, she knew he had chosen her not because she fit the mold, but because she didn't. Not because she completed his image, but because she undid his loneliness. That night, back at the estate, Elias said, "No one's ever made me feel like more by being less." Clara kissed him softly. "You're not more because of me. You're just finally letting yourself be who you are." And when they undressed slowly, deliberately, it wasn't about giving in. It was about letting go. Elias held her like a promise. Clara opened to him like trust. They moved with care, with awe, with the knowledge that this wasn't a mistake they'd regret. This was the beginning of something real. And for the first time in both their lives, love didn't feel like losing. It felt like home. 3 days after Elias chose Clara over the arranged merger marriage, the consequences began to unfurl with quiet, calculated precision. Headlines bloomed across every major outlet, not aggressive but surgical. Monroe airwalks away from power. CEO risks merger for unknown woman. Is Monroe Global losing its crown? The board issued statements. Stock analysts speculated. The whispers Elias had long trained himself to ignore were now roaring behind closed doors. And though Clara wasn't named directly, she was everywhere between the lines. At first, they tried to pretend it was just noise. She stayed in the penthouse with him, sketching while he took meetings, brewing coffee in the early mornings, wearing one of his button-downs like armor. But even in their silence, the truth started pressing against the walls. She could see it in the way he removed his cufflinks slower than usual, in the way he lingered at the window longer than necessary, in the growing weight beneath his eyes. One night, she found him sitting on the balcony floor, suit jacket thrown over the railing, his tie loose around his neck, the city behind him silent and uncaring. She stepped outside, sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and said nothing for a while. Then, softly, "Talk to me." Elias kept his eyes on the skyline. "I can handle the loss," he said. "The merger, the position, the board, but I can't stop them from thinking you're the reason it's all happening." Clara's breath caught. "They don't know me. They don't get to write my story." He turned to her slowly. "But they are. Every word, every headline, and I can't erase it." She looked at him, steady. "Then stop trying. Let them talk. You don't owe them the truth. You only owe it to yourself." Elias was quiet. Then he reached for her hand. "What if I walked away from all of it?" "You already did," she said. "Not fully," he whispered. "I've still been holding on to pieces, titles, expectations, control." Clara tilted her head, voice quiet. And what would you have without them? You, he said simply, and maybe for once, that would be enough. The next morning, Elias resigned publicly. He made no grand speech, just a statement. Power means nothing if you can't be honest about who you are and who you love. Monroe Global's stock dropped. The board panicked. The press erupted. But Elias didn't flinch. He drove Clara to the estate, outside the city, turned off his phone, and didn't look back. At first, the silence felt like a pause. Then it became a kind of healing. He cooked for her. She painted in the sunroom. They took long walks, sometimes without speaking. And when they did speak, it was soft and unfiltered. He told her about his father's quiet collapse after the betrayal, how Elias had learned to fear vulnerability because he'd seen what it cost. Clara told him about growing up with a mother who confused love with sacrifice, how she'd learned to keep herself small so others didn't feel threatened. In that quiet, they became more than lovers. They became safe, but peace never stays untouched for long. One morning, Clara's phone rang. It was her father. They hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. I saw the news, he said flatly. You've made quite the mess. She closed her eyes. I'm not calling for your approval. You're giving up your future for a man who's already burned his, he snapped. No, she said, voice steel beneath calm. I'm building a future with someone who finally sees me. She hung up before he could respond. When she turned around, Elias was watching her from the hallway, quiet. I didn't mean to listen, he said. She gave him a tired smile. Maybe I wanted you to hear it. He walked to her, pressed a kiss to her temple. You're stronger than you know. I learned from you. That night, they made love again, not because they were escaping something, but because they were finally grounded in it. Their bodies met like a memory long overdue. There was no rush, no urgency, just skin, breath, and devotion. He whispered her name like a truth he never thought he'd be brave enough to say, and she let him touch every scar, visible and hidden, without shame. In the days that followed, Elias changed. Not into someone new, but into the version of himself he had always buried beneath success. He started sketching again. Homes, community spaces, libraries, buildings that held people, not power. Clara brought him books, poems, quiet mornings. They didn't speak of legacy anymore. They spoke of roots, of building things that would last for the right reasons. Then one night, sitting beneath a blanket on the porch, Clara whispered, I'm scared. Elias looked at her, brows drawn. Of what? That this is too good, she admitted, that one day we'll forget why we risked everything. He took her hand, kissed the back of it. Then I'll remind you, every day, until we stop needing the reminder. And in the glow of soft lamplight, they promised each other not certainty, but choice. Every day, even when it's hard, even when it's quiet. Especially then. Clara rested her head against his shoulder. What happens now? He didn't hesitate. Now we build something real. And they did, quietly, together, with love that didn't need applause, only presence, with devotion that didn't need headlines, only honesty, with 2 hearts that chose to stay, not because it was easy, but because it was right. It was a Wednesday when the first letter arrived. Hand-delivered. No stamp, no name on the envelope, just heavy paper and heavier consequences. Elias opened it in the kitchen, Clara beside him, barefoot and still in his shirt. At first, she didn't register the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed, or how long he stared at the contents in silence. What is it? She asked. He handed her the letter without a word. It was from the Monroe Estate Legal Division, a formal notice informing Elias that the family trust was invoking the clause buried deep in the old contracts. If he didn't resume his leadership role within 30 days, he would forfeit the legacy assets passed down from his father's generation. Land, intellectual property, old company shares not yet sold off in the merger, everything he hadn't cared about until now, everything that, if lost, could cripple the community project they had just started to build. Clara read it again. They're threatening you with your past. Elias didn't answer. He looked out the window. No, they're trying to make me question our future. The following days unfolded like a slow unraveling, not in panic, not even in fear, but in the kind of stillness that comes when you're standing at a fork in the road, knowing both paths require sacrifice. Elias had built a blueprint for the future, and that blueprint depended on certain resources: land, meant for housing, funding for arts and mental health initiatives, silent investors who were still linked to his name. If he lost those things, they wouldn't just have to start over. They would have to start without ground to stand on. Clara watched him wrestle with it, not with anger, but with ache. Every night she traced the crease between his brows and asked nothing. Every morning she woke up beside him, knowing he was still searching for the right kind of answer. On the 5th day, she made the decision for both of them. She found him in the garden sketching under the late autumn sun. "You should go back," she said. He looked up, startled. "What?" "Just for now," she continued. "If regaining your name gives us the tools we need to build everything we dreamed about, then it's not a compromise. It's a foundation." He stood slowly, walking toward her. "Are you asking me to choose the world again?" "I'm asking you to choose us," she said, her voice low, "even if it means passing through the fire to get to the other side." Elias touched her cheek, his eyes stormy. "I don't want to lose you in the flames," she smiled. "Then don't let go." That evening he packed a bag, one suit, one notebook, one photo of her taped inside the cover. She didn't go with him. She stayed in the estate, surrounded by drafts and blueprints, sketching a future she refused to believe would be abandoned. In the city, Elias walked back into rooms he had once dominated. He didn't beg. He didn't defend. He made one proposal to hold the title long enough to protect the projects that mattered. The board pushed back. The media speculated. Anonymous sources leaked stories about his supposed breakdown, his reckless romance, his disappearance. Through it all, Elias stayed quiet, focused, steady. He signed the documents that gave him temporary control and blocked clauses that would have destroyed the trust's community commitments. And then, without waiting for applause, he left again. It took 8 days. Clara didn't hear from him once. Not because he didn't call, but because she didn't pick up. Not because she was angry, but because she was afraid that he would change, that he would stay, that he would come back a version of himself who no longer needed the girl who had once been unkissed and unwanted. On the 9th day, she sat in the garden where he used to draw, her sketch pad open but empty. The sky was gray, the breeze too still. She didn't cry. She simply whispered into the silence, "Come back." That night, she fell asleep on the couch wrapped in one of his sweaters, and in the middle of the night, a knock came. Soft, steady, familiar. She opened the door, and there he was. Not in a suit, not with headlines behind him, just Elias. Tired, beautiful, real. He didn't speak right away. He just handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was the deed to the land they'd chosen for their first project. In her name, solely. "You gave it up," she whispered. "I protected it," he corrected. "Then I left." "Why?" Her voice broke. "Because I realized nothing I build will matter if I lose the reason I wanted to build in the first place." She threw her arms around him before he could say anything else. They didn't make love that night. They lay in bed facing each other, eyes wide open, breath sinking in the dark. Every word they hadn't said lived between them like a vow. Elias brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Do you trust me again?" Clara nodded. "More than I trust myself." "Then let's go home." "We are home," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, everything changed, but only in ways that mattered. The project launched. Their team grew. Clara's name began to appear in articles not as Elias's distraction, but as the lead designer, the woman behind the sketches that turned into hope. Elias didn't reclaim his title. He didn't want it, but he kept the door open just wide enough to make sure no one closed it on her. They moved slowly, deliberately. They didn't rush to define what they were. They didn't announce anything to the world. They simply chose each other again, and again, and again. One morning, as Clara stood in the community garden they'd helped create, a little girl tugged on her hand. "Are you married to him?" the girl asked, pointing to Elias, who was teaching kids how to draw floor plans with crayons. Clara smiled. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because sometimes love isn't about rushing, it's about staying." The girl blinked. "That's boring." Clara laughed. "It's everything." That night, Elias pulled her onto the rooftop they used to sit on in the city. He handed her a ring, not flashy, not expensive, a silver band etched with her handwriting. She read the inscription aloud. "Still choosing you." He didn't get down on one knee. He just whispered, "Let's stop pretending we need the world's approval to love without apology." She kissed him like an answer. A week later, they were married beneath a tree they planted together. No press, no spectacle, just breath and truth and the beginning of something neither of them had dared imagine. Not a fairy tale, not a fantasy, just a life. Real, earned, chosen. Months later, the city was the same, loud and relentless, but the life Clara and Elias had built within it no longer belonged to that chaos. Their apartment wasn't high in the sky like the penthouse had been. It was lower, tucked into the quiet edge of a historic district filled with trees and uneven sidewalks. Clara's art studio sat on the first floor, sun spilling in across her work table, sketches pinned along the walls like fragments of memory. Elias worked from the back room, not as a CEO anymore, but as a consultant for community-centered designs, lending his vision to projects that now had heart instead of just profit. They didn't talk about legacy. They didn't talk about headlines. They talked about recipes, about book passages, about how the garden in the community park was blooming faster than expected. Every Sunday morning, they walked hand in hand to the cafe 2 blocks away. Sometimes, people stared, not because of who Elias used to be, but because of the way they moved together, quiet and whole, like nothing outside their joined hands could touch them. The first time someone asked Clara, "How did you know it would last?" She paused for a long moment before answering. "Because we built it on the truth, not on timing." The woman had nodded like she understood, but Clara could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. People always wanted to believe in magic, not the quiet work of choosing someone even when it's hard. That night, Elias found her on the couch staring at an old photo, the one she'd kept from the night they first met, when she'd said yes to a stranger's ridiculous proposal to pretend to be something she wasn't. She held the photo up. "Do you think we'd still be here if that night hadn't happened?" Elias didn't even hesitate. "Yes, maybe not like this, maybe not that fast, but I would have found you." She smiled. "You don't believe in fate." "No," he said, settling beside her, "but I believe in gravity, and somehow I was always pulled toward you." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "I still wake up some mornings and wonder if it's real." "Then I'll keep proving it is," he whispered. They didn't promise forever with elaborate words or staged photos. They promised it with small things. coffee made just the way she liked it, notes tucked into lunch bags, kisses pressed into the corners of smiles. One night, lying tangled in sheets still warm from sleep, Clara whispered, "I used to think being untouched meant I was incomplete. That I had to wait for someone to choose me before I could be something." Elias brushed her hair back. "You were never incomplete. You were just waiting for the person who saw you as whole from the start." She nodded, not because she needed convincing, but because she finally believed it. Love hadn't rescued her. She had rescued herself first. Love just gave her a place to land, and Elias, once the man who had everything but warmth, had found a kind of salvation, not in her innocence, but in her strength. They had loved each other through shame, through silence, through the fire, and now they loved each other in peace, quiet, certain, real. In the end, the girl who had never been kissed before him had become the woman he couldn't imagine breathing without. And the man who once thought control was power had learned that surrender, true, wholehearted surrender to something bigger than ego, was what made him invincible. Because some stories don't begin when two people fall into bed. They begin when they finally stop running from who they really are. And sometimes, one fake kiss is all it takes to reveal the kind of love that never needs pretending again.